Hello. Good morning. It's such an incredible honor to be here talking for the next 20 minutes about something that I'm super passionate and excited about, and talking uninterrupted, which is a luxury in the life of a parent of 2 small children. I'm going to be here all day, so if you do want to interrupt me, feel free to do so later on the day. I'm going to do a breakout session as well on the more technical side of the things that I'm talking about today. But the thing I want to talk about today in particular is server-side tagging and server-side flows. And as Ruben alluded, it's a way to perhaps, with good motivation, to get back in the driver's seat, to take back control with all this turbulence going on in our industry, seeking to kind of erode the data quality that we are so used to without compromising the end user's absolute and fundamental right to data protection. Very briefly about myself, I do want to mention that I'm the founder of 2 wonderful companies, and Simmer, which is a company I founded with my wife, Simo Ahava, is an online education portal. So if any of this that I talk about today rings true, you can check out our courses on teamsimmer.com. So today's agenda is going to be quite simple. I'll start with a brief explanation of what server-side tagging is, with a subtext that it's all about control. That's what server-side is. It's control, control, control. I'll then talk about the changes in our industry and how this control actually translates to resilience, how resilience against these changes will help you grow as a company and result. And finally, I'll do something I'm notoriously bad at, which is make predictions, but I'll look at the overall trend of what's happening and try to see where we might be going on in the server-side future. Now, if someone can give me a thumbs up if that sounds like a good agenda, I can get started. Thank you very much. So server-side tagging, when we talk about it, it's often juxtaposed with client-side tagging. Now, client-side tagging is how we've been doing marketing measurement for the last 25, 30 years. It involves deploying a pixel, a tracker, a piece of script, a piece of code, a tag on the website or on the user's device. And this tag or pixel or script or image or whatever is offered by the vendors. And they deploy them on the website, and they have full control over what is collected. And this leads to some interesting and sometimes unfortunate results, because by communicating, by allowing the end user's device to communicate directly with vendor servers, it opens the door for data breaches and data leaks, often unintentional, so collecting PII data to places where it shouldn't be collected to, personally identifiable information. It allows for cross-site tracking with third-party cookies. It allows for regulatory problems, and even in the worst-case scenario, malicious attacks such as cross-site scripting attacks if those domains are compromised. And these are all a result of the paradigm we've become completely accustomed to, so a browser or a device communicating directly with the vendor servers. With server-side tagging, we still have the same premise. We still have a device or a browser, typically, that needs to be tracked. We want to know what happens when users buy things, when they add things to the cart, when they share something on social media. But instead of sending this data directly to vendor servers, it passes through a buffer. It passes through something called a server container or a server-side tagging endpoint. Now, the important part here is that this is an upstream modification of the data flow. The data is passed to the server container first, and the server then relinquishes it to the vendors. But the server can, and usually does, do validation, anonymization, enrichment, performance improvements, transformations. It's like an upstream ETL pipeline, basically. You get to choose the exact shape and size of the data that the vendors eventually receive. Now, what this means, if you kind of squint your eyes and blur them a bit, when you look at client-side tagging, the control is firmly in the vendor side. They get to choose what they want to collect. When their scripts run in your users' browsers, your customers' browsers, the vendor has full control. They get to choose exactly what to track and what to measure. With server-side tagging, control is moved to you as a data controller. You get to choose what is actually collected. Now, I am manipulating you with these color designs, so I had red for vendor control and green for your control. It's not that black and white. I'm not saying that all vendors are bad. That's not what I'm saying, even though there's a subtext. What I am saying is that any type of control that you can regain as a data control is absolutely fundamental. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't abuse it as well. So hopefully today we'll be good people and not abuse it. So now that I've said control about 1,000,000 times, do we actually have control with server-side tagging? You think from what I'm saying is that we can basically just do tracking exactly as we want it, with full respect for user anonymity, for user agency. Server-side tagging still is subservient to many different forces in our marketing spectrum. Regulations, of course, control ultimately what kind of data flows we can use. GDPR is quite clearly technology agnostic. It doesn't care if it's client-side or server-side tracking. If you're processing personal data, you need to observe GDPR. You need to have a legal basis for that processing. There's always going to be a hunger for more data, so even if you want to use server-side tagging to collect less but in better quality, you might not be able to argue that case with your business owners. Google Tag, which has been mentioned today already, and yesterday I'm sure, is evolving into the main orchestration for Google's client-side tagging, and it also has a huge impact on how server-side tagging will develop in the future. And then we have things like browser features. If you want to measure what happens in the browser, you need to track something on the browser, even if you have a server-side endpoint. And that thing that runs in the browser will always be impacted by tracking protections, ITP, cookie lifetime things, and so on. So we're not rid of all of that data degradation that happens client-side when we move to server-side. So as a result, how much agency do we actually have? Now when we look at the things that actually detract our data client-side, now we need to make the case. Does server-side tagging give us enough tools to address these problems so that we can regain data quality in the way that we can still grow as a company? So let's look at the most common detractors. And I'm using quotes here because these detract from your data quality, but they might at the same time actually improve the user's right to data protection. And I'm kind of an old-fashioned guy in the way that I think that our users and customers are still very important. So we have to respect their agency ultimately. So we have the decline of the third-party cookie. This is, of course, a huge thing. We've been talking about it here. We talked about the privacy sandbox exhaustively. This also impacts the quality of our data collection efforts in ways that we might not even think about. Google Analytics, for example, which you might not necessarily typically connotate with a third-party cookies tool, also uses that technology to enrich audiences for remarketing, for passing demographic information, for example. So it's all around us, and this decline does impact us as well. Data protection laws, we just love those cookie banners and we can't wait to have more of them. They still impact how our client-side data collection will happen. And you all probably have seen the numbers that if you do a bang-up job complying with all the GDPR regulations, your consent rate is going to be like 10%, 15%. So it's quite a big difference from before. And then we have the general fragility of client-side. And this is, for me, this is the most interesting thing because we have things like network issues, we have browser tracking protection problems, we have cookie lifetimes being degraded, we have browsers that refuse any kind of tracking, not just Brave browser anymore, which used to be the black sheep. We have Firefox and Edge joining the camp as well. Safari has been blocking cookies, third-party cookies since 2003, so let's not pretend it's a new thing. And on top of that, we have all these different phenomena. We have just a lack of technical expertise. We have litigation. We have black box algorithms, PR damage from maluse of data. All of these things are just degrading our client-side data. So when we move server-side, we need to figure how to take that control and change it into a form of resilience. And this scientifically designed graph just implies that the more you rely your data collection mechanisms on client-side tools in the future, the riskier it will be from a data quality perspective. That's just the cold, hard fact of it. Client-side environments they haven't been viable for perfect measurement for years, but today they're even less so. And by moving to server-side, we can actually do these kinds of enrichments that typically you would do client-side without having to worry about them being degraded by these client-side detractors. We can send information to Google Ads without having to use the browser at all. We can write directly to a data warehouse. We can use our CRM or our other REST APIs to enrich the data, to pull that first-party data with server-side routes. So server-side can be a game changer for your company. First of all, it's resilient to the kinds of data quality detractors that impact client-side. It's resilient to them. There's no tracking protection mechanism server-side. You might be happy to know that it actually lets you avoid ad blockers as well, although if you talk to me later today, I'm going to try and persuade you that it's not necessarily a good thing. Client-side will also always be susceptible to these. For enrichment purposes, client-side will always be limited. It's very, very performance expensive. It's very complicated to build those enrichment pipelines into the browser or the user's device. So you're placing that overhead, that responsibility on the user's device to handle it. Whereas server-side, it's a scalable solution. It's almost built in. Data enrichment comes almost at the click of a button. For performance and speed, the more tags you add client-side, the more cumulative negative impact it will have on client-side performance. The browser needs to process all of that information. Whereas server-side, the more tags you move away from the client-side, the better the client-side performance will be. This is a zero-sum game, if there ever was one. So having said all these pros and cons, we now come to the place where they're still kind of at par. There's complexity. Server-side tagging is a specialization. It does require you to know, in its current shape and size, about tagging, maybe even a little bit about cloud engineering, and also how to orchestrate these data pipelines so that they no longer happen solely in the browser. And the complexity is in client-side too, so there's no easy way out here. For compliance, if you're thinking that server-side lets you kind of get off the hook with the laws and regulations, I'm sorry, my friends, that's not true. You will still need to be compliant. And server-side, it might even be a bit more difficult to be compliant, as I'll get back to you shortly about that. And this is where server-side currently loses to client-side. Client-side is transparent. When something is sent from the user's browser to a meta server or a Google Ads server or a Google Analytics server, that network request is visible in the browser. Anybody who knows how to use developer tools, especially auditors and GDPR watchdogs, they will be able to see exactly if that data controller is respecting their legal obligations. They can see what is collected to those vendors. But with server-side tagging, what the auditor sees is a random bit of data sent to a server somewhere, and then nothing. That's where the visibility ends. So I use the Vegas rule. What happens in the server stays in the server. It's not visible to the browser, and this is a huge problem, and one that I haven't heard of a good solution yet, and one that absolutely requires remedy, because it's how the internet was built. There's a client-server architecture, which is a separation of concerns. One does not know what happens in the other. But with server-side tagging, we are talking about sensitive data flows. We need to have that transparency. So this is where client-side still prevails. Similarly, server-side isn't absolutely free. There's a non-zero cost to it. You have to set up infrastructure. You have to have some kind of a foundation for that server. You have to handle the network egress traffic, so all the traffic passing through. Whereas client-side is free, but we all know what free means in the data world. But you don't pay for the luxury of deploying a JavaScript on a site. You might pay for a license just to use that tool, but you don't pay for the actual deployment, whereas server-side you do pay. So it's not like I'm going to say, tell all of you instantly start doing server-side and it will help you with everything. There are nuances here. But the one thing where server-side absolutely triumphs, and the one thing I've been talking about earlier, is the fact that control is upstream. And this is foundational. You get to decide what the vendors receive. This is now the 1,256th time I've said this. You get to decide what the vendors receive. The vendors don't get to decide for you. I am standing on a vendor stage today, but I think this needs to be called out. As much as we'd like for it to be true, Google doesn't necessarily know exactly what your company needs. They have their own interests and their own vested interests, and that's of course how it works. But with server-side tagging, you can choose exactly what works for your company. So now to the awkward part of this presentation, if the stuff that was before wasn't awkward enough. Predictions. First of all, we're moving from a cookie-centric to a browser-centric paradigm. This means that instead of third-party cookies doing cross-site audience building, we are moving to APIs such as those of the Privacy Sandbox or on WebKit, the Private Click Measurement API. So the browser will take and handle these mechanisms for us. Now, what does this mean for server-side? Well, server-side can't replace that because server-side is basically same domain, it's same origin tracking almost. it doesn't help you build those cross-site audiences. So if you still want your visitor data to be fed into a cross-site identity graph, such as for Floodlight or DoubleClick or whatever, it will still need those browser APIs. So we're probably going to be seeing a hybrid, which is the next thing, a client-server hybrid, where you're still doing some tracking in the client. We can't get rid of that. We still need to run those scripts there, not just for tracking what happens in the browser, but also for communicating with these browser APIs. A very interesting development is vendor-owned gateways. And we see this with Meta already. They have their CAPI gateway, which is basically almost a one-click installation of server-side processes. So if you want to do first-party data collection to Meta, you basically just click a couple of buttons in their interface and they will set everything up for you. Now, I'm going to be predicting that in the future, and there's no inside knowledge here, I'm hopefully not behind it. No, I don't need an NDA because I don't know really. I'm imagining a future where when you deploy Google Tag, you also have the option of one-clicking a server-side setup to go along with it. And then Google will kind of handle the infrastructure for you. You might have to pay something for it. Maybe it's a 360 thing for enterprise customers or whatever, but it's coming because it would make so much sense. There's no complexity to it. It just means building additional infrastructure. So Google Tag is kind of a question mark. It is here. It's the number one, it's the most important way for Google to orchestrate their client-side measurement. How much of it will impact server-side tagging? We already see a very tight integration there. If you want to do server-side tagging with the Google stack, you need the Google Tag to run client-side. It's very, very difficult to do with alternative methods, which kind of sucks because you would like the freedom of choosing what's running in the browser, but I do understand it because there are so many kind of client-side and server-side toggles that Google Tag runs on. Regulation doesn't currently call out server-side specifically. It's annoyingly technology agnostic, which helps fatten the wallets of all the GDPR lawyers who can just niggle over the details. But I would hope that when e-privacy becomes a regulation, maybe in the fourth millennia of this planet, we will have server-side called out specifically so that it's no longer considered just the cookie law, which it still for some people is, but it's an overall mechanism for how a user's data is stored and preserved across network flows. And server-side is absolutely fundamental there. And then we have the question of transparency, which is unsolved. And this is something I could go talk about for ages, but transparency to the server needs to happen, but we don't yet know how that will actually come to pass. So we are on a seesaw. On the one hand, we have a technology that gives you control, and as data controllers, it gives you a way to grow your business with this kind of information. But the more things you do in the server, the less agency the user has over their data flows. The user needs to trust you more to respect their client-side decisions, their consent, their agency, and your obligations as data controls. They need to trust you. Because their ad blockers don't work anymore because you started using server-side tagging. Now they can't even block those flows. So the responsibility is in your hands. And this now has two additional variables, this seesaw. First of all, first-party data. Every single vendor who has access to an identity graph will come knocking on your door to get that from you. This is going to be the most viable way to replace third-party cookies in the future, regardless of what happens with Privacy Sandbox. Your email address and your customer's email address and their phone number, their names, their addresses, those are static identifiers. There's legal and ethical question marks all over the place with it, but if you do it in a stand-up way and if you map those data flows, if you know that you have the appropriate legal basis to collect that and process that personal data, then first-party data collection is one of the big solutions to the decline in match rates and to the general unreliability of the kind of one-on-one marketing and remarketing that third-party cookies have offered. And at the same time, Google will continue to incentivize Google Tag as the main collector, which is a very interesting development for server-side tagging's future. So kind of summa summarum, server-side is a great way to consolidate data streams. It's a great way to reduce redundancy client-side. The browser no longer needs to send 7 different requests to 7 different vendors, all with the same payload. It's stupid. It's a complete waste of resources. The same information sent to 7 different places. It makes no sense. Server-side can let you actually reduce the redundancies. It can be an amazing asset in securing data flows in a privacy-first world. It can be, I'm using the conditional here. It can be. You can also mess it up and make it a total data breach. Server-side, it's a tool for governance. It's specifically a tool for control. It's not necessarily a data hoarding solution. It's being pitched constantly as a way to get more data, and I've never quite understood why people do that, because then you'll be kind of disappointed in how much it actually gets you back. But in this case, it's quality over quantity anytime. It's a surgical tool for specific use cases. You'll need to map those use cases before jumping on the bandwagon. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all your data-related problems. I'm really bad at pitching it, by the way. Just realized And it's also vulnerable to a manipulative mindset. And this, I think, is ultimately it. The Vegas rule, when you think about it, it lets you do all sorts of stuff behind the veil of the server. Keep a level head. Learn enough about the technology to make a wise and risk-averse business decision. And I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to say all of you immediately press the button to deploy server-side tagging for you, but I'm going to say to all of you, if you haven't done it yet with your company, listen to an agency or to Google or to other vendors who are doing this and hear what they have to say and think about if server-side tagging could really be your tool for control in this super unreliable future. So thank you for your attention, and I hope to see as many of you as possible in the breakout and in the hallways.